Get on the ground. Hands behind your head.
Officer, I need you to calm down and listen to me.
I said get on the ground. You're under arrest.
I'm a federal agent. Check my credentials.
Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them.
My badge and gun left side. DEA Agent Keisha Washington.
Yeah, right. A pretty little thing like you, not buying it.
We're making a big...
At 11:30 p.m. on a Friday night in Phoenix, Arizona, Officer Brad Coleman was about to have the worst encounter of his 8-year police career. He thought he was making a drug bust that would finally prove to his supervisors that he deserved that promotion he'd been passed over for 3 times. Instead, he was about to try to arrest a DEA agent with 15 years of federal law enforcement experience, advanced tactical training, and absolutely zero tolerance for incompetent cops who let their racial and gender biases cloud their judgment. Coleman had no idea that the black woman he was pointing his weapon at had led undercover operations against major drug cartels. He had no idea she spoke 4 languages, held black belts in 2 martial arts, and had testified before Congress about border security. He had no idea that her phone contained direct contact numbers for FBI directors, federal judges, and cartel informants whose lives depended on her discretion. Most importantly, Coleman had no idea that every second of this encounter was being recorded on his body camera, creating evidence that would soon be reviewed by federal prosecutors, internal affairs investigators, and a disciplinary board that would question his fitness for duty. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. This encounter is about to get absolutely wild, and the way this DEA agent handles the situation will leave you speechless. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think about officers who can't handle strong, competent women. This story is everything. Special Agent Keisha Washington had been working undercover for 6 months, infiltrating a drug distribution network that stretched from Phoenix to Los Angeles. At 38 years old, she was one of the DEA's most experienced agents with a record of successful operations that had resulted in hundreds of arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in drugs and assets. That Friday night, Keisha was concluding a meeting with a confidential informant at a 24-hour diner in a rough part of town. She was dressed to blend in with the criminal element she was investigating. Dark jeans, leather jacket, her natural hair, and a protective style that could easily be covered by a hood when needed. To anyone watching, she looked like she belonged in that world, which is exactly what Officer Brad Coleman thought when he saw her walking their car in the parking lot. Coleman had been patrolling the area looking for easy arrests that might boost his statistics and finally get him some recognition from his supervisors. At 32 years old, he had been repeatedly passed over for promotions, and it was eating at him. His academy classmates had advanced to detective or sergeant, while he remained a patrol officer working the night shift. Deep down, Coleman knew why he hadn't been promoted. His arrest rates were mediocre. His report writing was sloppy. He had a tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily, and he didn't work well with female officers or supervisors. But rather than acknowledge these shortcomings, Coleman had developed a narrative that he was being held back by political correctness and diversity initiatives that favored women and minorities over qualified men like himself. When Coleman saw Keisha walking across the parking lot, several things triggered his prejudiced nature. She was a young black woman, alone in a high-crime area late at night. In Coleman's racist mind, that automatically meant drug activity or criminal behavior. He had internalized the same stereotypes that led him to patrol certain neighborhoods more heavily and stop black drivers at disproportionate rates. He also noticed her confident posture, the way she scanned her surroundings, the purposeful way she moved. These were actually signs of law enforcement training, but Coleman interpreted them through the lens of his racial bias. To him, a black woman moving with confidence and awareness could only mean one thing: criminal activity. Coleman pulled his patrol car into the parking lot and activated his overhead lights. Keisha immediately noticed the police presence and understood what was happening. As an experienced federal agent, she recognized the signs an officer who was about to make a bad stop based on assumptions rather than evidence. Keisha remained calm and calculated her next moves. She could have immediately identified herself as a federal agent, but she wanted to see how this would play out. Sometimes these encounters provided valuable intelligence about local police practices, especially regarding potential corruption or civil rights violations. She also recognized something else about Coleman's approach that concerned her: his body language, his aggressive posture, the way he was already reaching for his weapon. This wasn't a routine investigative stop. This was an officer who had already decided she was guilty of something and was prepared to use force to prove it. Get on the ground, hand behind your head. Coleman shouted the moment he got out of his patrol car. Kesha didn't comply. As a federal agent, she knew that Coleman had no legal authority to order her to ground without reasonable suspicion of a specific crime. His command was unlawful, and she wasn't going to legitimize it by following it. "Officer, I need you to calm down and listen to me," Kesha replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. Coleman's response revealed everything about his mindset and his insecurities. He heard a black woman telling him to calm down, and his fragile ego couldn't handle it. In his mind, black women were supposed to be submissive and compliant, especially when confronted by a white man with a badge. He said, "Get on the ground. You're under arrest." Kesha made a strategic decision. She was going to identify herself as a federal agent, but she was going to do it in a way that created a clear record of Coleman's improper response. "I'm a federal agent. Check my credentials." This should have been the moment when Coleman reassessed the situation. Any competent officer would have stepped back, asked for clarification, and allowed the person to safely produce their identification. That's basic police procedure when someone claims to be law enforcement. Instead, Coleman escalated further. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." Kesha slowly indicated her service weapon and badge. "My badge and gun left side. DEA Agent Kesha Washington." The sight of Kesha's federal credentials should have ended the encounter immediately, but Coleman's fragile masculinity and deep-seated racial biases kicked in. He couldn't accept that he had just tried to arrest a black federal agent. More importantly, he couldn't accept that the federal agent was a woman who was clearly more competent and professional than he was. Yeah, right. A pretty little thing like you not buying it. Those words, "pretty little thing," revealed everything about Coleman's character. His sexism, his racism, his inability to accept black female authority, his need to diminish black women to protect his own fragile sense of superiority. Kesha's response was perfect and ominous. "You are making a big mistake." Quick question for everyone watching. How many red flags do you see in this officer's behavior so far? Let me know in the comments. Kesha understood exactly what was happening. She had encountered officers like Coleman throughout her career. White men who were threatened by competent black women, and who used their badges to try to assert dominance they couldn't earn through skill or professionalism. But Kesha also knew how to handle these situations. She had 15 years of experience dealing with hostile suspects, uncooperative informants, and dangerous criminals. An insecure patrol officer with racial issues wasn't going to rattle her. "Officer, what's your name and badge number?" Kesha asked, pulling out her phone to document the encounter. Coleman saw the phone and panicked. In the era of viral videos and police accountability, he knew that recordings could end careers. But instead of de-escalating and trying to salvage the situation, he made it worse. "Put that phone away. You're interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" Kesha asked calmly. "You haven't articulated any suspected criminal activity. You saw a black woman in a parking lot and decided to arrest her. That's not an investigation. That's racial profiling." Coleman was trapped. He had no reasonable suspicion for the stop, no evidence of criminal activity, and no legal justification for any of his actions. Worse, he had just questioned the credentials of a federal agent and made racist comments on camera. "Look, I don't care what badge you think you have," Coleman said, his voice rising. "I'm in charge here, and you're going to do what I say." This statement revealed the core of Coleman's problem. He believed that his authority came from his badge and his whiteness rather than from the law. He thought being in charge meant he could ignore constitutional rights and federal authority. Kesha decided it was time to educate Coleman about how law enforcement actually works. "Officer, you seem to be confused about something. I'm not in charge, and neither are you. The law is in charge, and the law says you can't detain someone without reasonable suspicion. You can't arrest someone without probable cause. And you definitely can't ignore federal law enforcement credentials because you don't like the race and gender of the person carrying them." The way Kesha delivered this explanation, calm, professional, completely factual, made Coleman's incompetence even more obvious. Here was a real law enforcement professional explaining basic constitutional principles to someone who was supposed to already know them. Coleman's response showed just how far out of his depth he was. Don't lecture me about the law. I've been doing this for 8 years. And in 8 years, you apparently never learned that DEA agents have federal authority that supersedes local jurisdiction. Kesha replied, "You've never learned proper identification procedures for law enforcement personnel, and you've clearly never learned to check your racial and gender biases at the door." Each of Kesha's statements was like a surgical strike. She wasn't insulting Coleman or attacking him personally. She was simply stating facts about his professional failures, which made her points even more devastating. Coleman tried to regain control of the narrative. "I don't have to take this attitude from someone like you." "Someone like me?" Kesha asked, her voice still calm, but with a steel edge. "You mean a federal agent, a law enforcement professional? Or do you mean a black woman who knows her rights and won't be intimidated by your badge?" The body camera captured Coleman's face at that moment. The realization that he was being professionally dismantled by someone he tried to diminish as a pretty little thing was written all over his expression. Coleman made one last attempt to salvage his authority. "I want to see identification from your supervisor. I want to verify these credentials." Kesha smiled. This was the opening she had been waiting for. "Absolutely," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling my supervisor right now." Kesha dialed a number and put the call on speaker. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Washington, this better be important. It's almost midnight. Sorry to wake you, Zach Morrison. I need you to verify my credentials to a local officer who's questioning my authority and making racially charged comments." Special Agent in charge, Robert Morrison, had been Kesha's supervisor for 3 years. He knew her reputation and trusted her judgment completely. He also immediately understood what was happening. "Put me on with the officer," Morrison said, his voice taking on an official tone. Kesha handed her phone to Coleman. "Special Agent in charge Morrison wants to speak with you." Coleman took the phone reluctantly. "This is Officer Coleman, Phoenix PD. Officer Coleman, you are currently detaining one of my most experienced agents during a federal investigation. She has federal authority that supersedes your local jurisdiction, and I need you to release her immediately. Is there a problem?" Coleman's voice became defensive. "Sir, I was just trying to verify her identity. She was acting suspicious in a high-crime area." "Acting suspicious how?" Coleman realized he had no good answer. "Well, she looked like she didn't belong." The silence on the phone was deafening. Morrison was a 25-year law enforcement veteran who had heard every excuse for bad policing. He knew exactly what "didn't belong" meant when applied to a black woman. "Officer Coleman, Agent Washington has been conducting a federal investigation in your jurisdiction for months. She has every right to be where she was now. Are you going to release her, or do I need to call your chief and the FBI Civil Rights Division?" Coleman handed the phone back to Kesha. His authority had been completely undermined, not by Kesha's defiance, but by his own incompetence in the reality of federal law enforcement hierarchy. "Thank you, Zach Morrison," Kesha said into the phone. "I'll file my report in the morning, and I'll be recommending a civil rights investigation." "Make sure you do. In Washington." Excellent work handling the professionally under circumstances that would have justified a much stronger response. After Kesha hung up, Coleman stood there looking defeated. His attempt to assert dominance had backfired completely. He had been outclassed, outprofessional, and embarrassed on his own body camera. "Officer Coleman," Kesha said, "I'm going to give you some free advice. Your problem isn't that black women are getting promoted over you. Your problem is that you're not as good at this job as you think you are, and your racial biases are making you even worse. Until you acknowledge that and work to improve, you're going to keep getting passed over." Coleman's face flushed red. Having his professional shortcomings pointed out by a black woman was apparently more than his ego could handle. "You people think you're so smart," Coleman muttered. "You people," Kesha repeated, making sure the body camera caught his racist language clearly. "Officer Coleman, you just proved every point I made about your biases, and it's all on camera." With that, Kesha walked to her car and drove away, leaving Coleman standing in the parking lot with his body camera, recording every moment of his humiliation and his racist comments. The encounter had lasted 16 minutes. 16 minutes that would change both of their careers, but in very different ways. Do you think this officer learned anything from this encounter? Let me know what you think in the comments. Kesha didn't file a formal complaint immediately. As an experienced federal agent, she understood the value of strategic timing. She wanted to see if Coleman would learn from the encounter, or if he would continue the behavior that had led to this situation. She didn't have to wait long for her answer. 3 days later, Kesha received a call from Phoenix PD Internal Affairs. Coleman had filed a complaint against her, claiming that she had been uncooperative during a lawful investigation and had used her federal position to intimidate a local officer. He also claimed she had been racially hostile and disrespectful to law enforcement. When Internal Affairs Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez called Quesa, she apologized for the inconvenience and explained that they were required to investigate all complaints, even obviously frivolous ones. Agent Washington, I've reviewed Officer Coleman's body camera footage, and frankly, I'm embarrassed that one of our officers filed this complaint. His language and behavior were completely unprofessional. Would you be willing to come in and give us a statement? Kesha agreed to the interview. When she arrived at Phoenix PD headquarters, she brought something with her that Coleman probably hadn't expected. Her own recording of the encounter. As a federal agent working undercover, Kesha routinely recorded her interactions for evidence purposes. Her recording captured everything that Coleman's body camera had missed, including his muttered racist comments after she drove away. During the Internal Affairs interview, Kesha remained professional and factual. She didn't express anger or demand punishment. She simply described what had happened and provided her analysis of Coleman's behavior. Officer Coleman demonstrated several concerning patterns, Quesa told Sergeant Rodriguez. He initiated contact without reasonable suspicion. He escalated to arrest language without probable cause. He questioned legitimate federal credentials based on racial and gender bias. He refused to accept federal authority. He made multiple racist and sexist comments. And most concerning, he filed a false complaint to try to cover up his own misconduct. Sergeant Rodriguez had been investigating officer misconduct for 12 years, and she recognized a clear-cut case when she saw one. The body camera footage supported everything Kesha had said and more. The Internal Affairs investigation revealed that Coleman's encounter with Kesha was part of a pattern. Over the previous 2 years, Coleman had received multiple complaints from black citizens, female officers, and minority supervisors. All of them described similar behavior: racist and sexist attitudes, unnecessary aggression, and an apparent inability to accept authority from anyone who wasn't a white male. The investigation also found that Coleman's arrest patterns showed clear racial and gender bias. He stopped black women at 3 times the rate of his colleagues, and his arrests of black citizens were more likely to result in dropped charges or dismissed cases, suggesting they were often based on insufficient evidence and racial profiling. When Coleman was interviewed by Internal Affairs, he didn't help his own cause. Instead of acknowledging his mistakes and accepting responsibility, he doubled down on his complaint against Kesha and made even more problematic statements. She was disrespectful and uncooperative, Coleman insisted. She wouldn't follow my lawful orders. These people always think they're above the law. What lawful orders? Sergeant Rodriguez asked. You ordered her to the ground without reasonable suspicion of any crime. She looked suspicious. She didn't belong in that area. Officer Coleman, Agent Washington, is a federal law enforcement officer conducting a legitimate investigation. She has every right to be in any area of this city. Your statement that she didn't belong suggests you made assumptions based on her race. The interview continued for 2 hours, and with each question, Coleman dug himself deeper. He couldn't articulate reasonable suspicion for the stop. He couldn't explain why he had questioned legitimate federal credentials. He couldn't justify his refusal to accept federal authority. Worst of all, he continued to make racist statements, referring to these people and their attitude when talking about black citizens and federal agents. The Internal Affairs report was devastating for Coleman. It found that he had violated multiple department policies: improper detention procedures, failure to recognize federal authority, discriminatory enforcement, racial bias, sexual harassment, and filing a false complaint. The report recommended immediate termination for cause, forfeit of pension benefits, and referral to federal prosecutors for potential civil rights violations. But before the discipline could be implemented, Kesha's story went public. A civil rights attorney had obtained the body camera footage through a public records request. When the video hit social media, it exploded across platforms within hours. Black DEA agent school's racist cop, who tried to arrest and became a viral sensation, shared millions of times and analyzed by law enforcement experts, civil rights advocates, and social media commentators. The footage was a masterclass in how to handle police misconduct while black. Kesha's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Coleman's obvious racism and incompetence. Her knowledge of the law highlighted his ignorance. Her composure exposed his emotional instability and racial bias. Legal experts pointed out that Kesha had done everything right. She had identified herself as law enforcement when appropriate. She had remained calm under racially charged circumstances. She had documented the encounter. She had followed proper procedures for resolving the conflict through supervisory channels. Civil rights advocates use the video to highlight ongoing issues with police racism and bias against black women. Specifically, they noted that if Kesha had been an ordinary black citizen without federal credentials and powerful supervisors, Coleman's behavior might never have been challenged. Law enforcement trainers began using the footage in academies and continuing education programs. It became a textbook example of how racial bias leads to professional disaster and how black professionals handle discrimination with dignity and strength. The Phoenix Police Department found itself under intense federal scrutiny. The FBI opened a civil rights investigation. The mayor demanded answers about racist officers and accountability. The city council called for reviews of all officers' arrest patterns and complaint histories. Most damaging for Coleman, the video made him a national symbol of racist policing. His name became associated with everything wrong with police culture and racial bias in law enforcement. Coleman was terminated from the Phoenix Police Department within a week of the video going viral. The final termination letter cited racial bias, gender discrimination, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. But Coleman's problems were just beginning. The FBI civil rights investigation resulted in federal charges against him for violating Kesha's civil rights under color of law. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Coleman was also sued personally by Kesha in federal court for civil rights violations. Because he had clearly acted outside the scope of lawful police authority, he couldn't claim qualified immunity protection. Coleman tried to appeal his termination and fight the federal charges, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His own body camera footage showed him making racist statements, questioning legitimate federal authority, and filing false reports. Eventually, Coleman pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations in exchange for an 18-month prison sentence. He also agreed to pay $1.75000 in damages to Kesha and to surrender his law enforcement certification permanently. Coleman never worked in law enforcement again. After serving his federal prison sentence, he found that his name was so associated with racist policing that even private security companies wouldn't hire him. He eventually took a job at a warehouse, making less than a quarter of what he had earned as a police officer. Kesha, meanwhile, continued her distinguished federal career. Her handling of the Coleman encounter became legendary within DEA circles, and she was often asked to speak at training events about dealing with racial bias and maintaining professionalism under pressure. She was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent 6 months after the incident, and eventually became one of the youngest SACs in DEA history. Her success stood in stark contrast to Coleman's downfall, illustrating the difference between competence and racism, between professionalism and prejudice. The Phoenix Police Department implemented sweeping reforms after the incident. They brought in federal monitors to review all arrest patterns. They instituted mandatory bias training for all officers. They created an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints from minority citizens. Most importantly, they began taking complaints about racial bias seriously. The 7 complaints against Coleman that had been dismissed might have prevented Kesha's experience if they had been properly investigated. The body camera footage from that Phoenix parking lot is still used in training programs across the country. It serves as a reminder that racial bias has no place in law enforcement, that federal authority supersedes local prejudice, and that professional behavior will always triumph over racist attitudes. Coleman's career ended because he couldn't handle the reality that a black woman was not only his equal in law enforcement, but clearly his superior in every professional measure. His racism and sexism led him to challenge someone who was demonstrably more competent, more professional, and more knowledgeable than he was. Kesha's career flourished because she understood that competence speaks louder than bias, that professionalism overcomes prejudice, and that the law doesn't care about anyone's racial hang-ups or gender insecurities. The lesson from that 16-minute encounter is clear. In law enforcement, as in life, competence and character matter more than race or gender. Professionalism matters more than prejudice, and knowledge matters more than assumptions. Coleman learned too late that trying to use racism and sexism to diminish others only reveals your own inadequacies. Kesha proved that the best response to bias isn't anger or confrontation, but simply being so undeniably professional and competent that your critics expose their own failures by trying to challenge you. If this story inspired you or taught you something about handling racism and bias with strength and professionalism, make sure you're subscribed for more content like this. And drop a comment letting me know what you thought about how Agent Washington handled this situation. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about one bad encounter or one racist cop. It's a story about the ongoing challenges that black women face in professional settings and how excellence and professionalism can overcome even the most entrenched racial and gender biases. Agent Washington showed that when you know who you are and what you're capable of, no amount of racism or sexism from others can diminish your authority or derail your success. Sometimes the best victory is simply being so undeniably excellent that your critics destroy themselves trying to tear you down. That's a lesson that extends far beyond law enforcement. It's a lesson for anyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or attacked because of their race, gender, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with their ability to excel. Kesha Washington proved that excellence is the best response to prejudice, that competence is the ultimate answer to bias, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do is simply be so good at your job that racists and sexists expose themselves trying to challenge you.